3 people who still avoid the places where it happened. Most frightening animal encounters have an explanation, even when they don't feel that way in the moment. A bear can stand upright. A coyote with mange can look nothing like the animal you expect. Darkness can make 20 yards feel like 50, and fear can change the size of almost anything. That's why none of these people immediately believed they had seen something impossible. The first grew up spending hunting season with his father and uncle. He knew those woods well enough that being scared there would have embarrassed him. The second spent years driving the same rural mail route, passing the same driveways, dogs, abandoned houses, and drainage ditches every day. The third wasn't somewhere remote at all. He was home in a normal neighborhood when something began appearing near a culvert behind his family's yard. What connects their stories isn't certainty, it's how ordinary the beginning felt. Each of them noticed something small before anything frightening happened. A track, a movement, sound that was easy to explain away. At the time, none of it seemed important. Later, those were the details they kept returning to. The first story started in a place I had trusted since childhood. Story 1. The thing beside the logging road. The place my father taught me not to fear. I was 19 the last year I went hunting with my dad and my uncle in those woods. By then, the trip felt less like hunting and more like a family ritual we happened to carry rifles through. We stayed in the same old camper my uncle had bought when I was a kid. It always smelled faintly of propane, damp plywood, and whatever coffee my dad had burned that morning. He awoke before sunrise without an alarm and made it so strong my uncle used to say it could strip paint. My uncle handled breakfast differently, kept jerky, peanut butter crackers, and canned coffee in the truck, and called that good enough. Most mornings began with us scraping mud from our boots on the camper steps, while an old radio hissed between the only 2 stations it could pick up. We had been coming there for years, and I knew the trails, creek beds, and tree stands almost as well as I knew my own neighborhood. About half a mile from where we usually hunted was an old logging road. It cut through a thicker section of woods and was rarely used except by hunters or forestry crews. Nothing about that place frightened me then. My dad had made sure of that. He was practical about animals, and even more practical about fear. If something screamed at night, it was a fox. If brush moved beside the trail, it was probably a deer. Scratching near camp meant raccoons. Strange calls were owls. Repeating noises were usually branches rubbing in the wind. There was always an explanation. He was not easily frightened either. That was why later the thing I remembered most wasn't what crossed the road. It was the expression on my father's face when he saw it. The tracks that didn't matter yet. Looking back, I think the encounter really started during our first 2 days there, though none of us treated anything as unusual at the time. The first thing I noticed was a set of tracks near the logging road. Rain had softened the ground, and the prints were stretched enough that I couldn't make out exactly what had made them. They looked canine at first, just longer than I expected. My uncle glanced down and joked that somebody had lost the world's biggest stray dog. We laughed and kept walking. Later that afternoon, we passed another hunting camp a little farther down the ridge. The family there had brought an old brown dog that usually wandered around, greeting everyone. But when its owner tried leading it toward the logging road, the dog planted its feet and pulled backward hard enough to slip its collar. Nobody thought much of that either. The part I remember most happened near dusk. My dad and I were walking back toward camp when something started moving through the brush off to our right. We could hear steady footfalls keeping roughly parallel with us, hidden behind thick trees and undergrowth. Dad said it was probably a deer. Then we stopped. The footsteps stopped too. We started walking again, and a few seconds later the movement started again. At the time it felt strange, but not threatening. Looking back now, that was probably the first moment something was following us from somewhere just beyond the tree line. Something started following the road the following evening was when the whole thing stopped feeling easy to explain. Rain was supposed to move in overnight, so my uncle and I took the truck down the logging road to pick up some equipment we had left near one of the stands. It was getting dark, but there was still enough light to see between the trees. A few minutes in, I noticed movement off the passenger side. At first I thought it was a deer running through the woods beside us. I could only catch pieces of it between the trunks, a dark back, something long moving low through the brush, then nothing. My uncle saw it too. He slowed the truck. Whatever was inside the trees seemed to slow with us. He gave the gas pedal a little more pressure. The movement picked up again, Neither of us said much for the next few seconds. We kept trying to get a clear look, but we never saw the whole animal. Once the headlights caught what looked like a pair of long legs. Another time I saw a brief reflection where I expected eyes to be, then it disappeared behind the trees. It never crossed the road. When we got back, my uncle didn't tell my dad. Said Dad would spend the rest of the night making jokes about us getting nervous over a deer. A few hours later, I woke to gravel shifting outside the camper. Then came a scrape against the metal trailer hitch. A few seconds after that, I heard leaves compressing near the back wall. My dad sat up before I did. He listened without talking. Something knocked over an empty plastic water container outside. Dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. There was nothing there. The container was lying almost 20 feet from where we had left it. My uncle blamed the wind. Nobody argued. I barely slept after that. The next morning, there were muddy tracks around the camper. Several looked similar to the prints we had seen near the logging road. But the ground was churned up from our own boots, so nothing was clear enough to identify. That was when I noticed my dad had gotten quieter. Still said it was probably a large stray dog, maybe even a thin bear moving strangely in the dark. But while he poured his coffee, he looked toward the trees and said that if the weather got worse, we might head home a day early. For him, that was unusual. I had never shortened one of those trips because of rain before. Usually bad weather meant another pot of coffee, wet socks, and an extra night playing cards inside. What crossed the headlights? By our final evening, the rain had started coming down steadily, enough to blur the edges of the road in the headlights. My dad and I had driven out to collect a trail camera before the weather got worse. On the way back, we took the same logging road we had been talking about all week. We were maybe 30 yards from a bend when something moved across the road in front of us. At first I thought it was a deer, then it stepped fully into the headlights. It was too thin through the body, with a narrow torso and front limbs that looked longer than they should have. For the first few steps, it moved on all fours. Then somewhere near the center of the road, it seemed to straighten. I still don't know if it actually stood up. The ground there was uneven, and the rain made everything look distorted through the windshield. It could have climbed onto higher ground. It could have shifted its weight in a way that made it look taller. But for 1 second, it looked wrong. It reached the opposite ditch, stopped, and turned toward us. The headlights caught part of its face. I remember a narrow shape, wet fur or skin reflecting light, and eye shine that disappeared whenever it moved its head. My dad reached over and locked the doors. That sound bothered me more than anything. I asked him what it was. He didn't answer. The animal dropped into the ditch and disappeared between the trees. Dad waited a few seconds, then started driving again. We had gone maybe 50 yards when I heard something crashing through the brush beside the truck. It was keeping pace with us. My dad accelerated. The noise accelerated too. He drove faster than I had ever seen him drive on that road, and neither of us spoke until we reached camp. Once we were inside the camper, my uncle asked what happened. Dad only said we were leaving early, and he locked the camper door and refused to step outside again that night. My father never went back. We left before sunrise the next morning.
Ouch.
My uncle tried joking about it while we packed, saying at least whatever had been outside saved us from another day of bad coffee and wet boots. Usually my dad would have laughed. This time he just kept loading the truck. For most of the drive home, nobody mentioned what we had seen. Eventually I asked him what he thought it was. He kept his eyes on the road and said it was probably a sick bear, maybe a large dog that looked strange in the rain. He gave me the kind of explanation he had given me my whole life. But he didn't sound like he believed it. A few months later, he sold the camper. He never said the trip was the reason. He just said we weren't using it enough anymore. After that, our yearly hunting trips stopped. Years later, I mentioned going back to that area with a friend. My dad looked at me for a second and said, "There are plenty of other places to hunt." That was all. I can still explain away what I saw that night. Rain, bad visibility, a sick animal, uneven ground. Any of those could be true. What I can't explain is my father. I had spent decades in those woods. He had never been afraid of them before. And after that night, he never went back. The next person wasn't hunting or camping at all. She was simply doing her job. Story 2. The animal on Route 17. I knew every house on that road I had been driving Route 17 for almost 4 years by then. Long enough that I knew the road better than I knew some parts of my own town. Most people would have seen the same houses, barns, fields, and mailboxes every day. I noticed smaller things. I knew which driveway flooded after heavy rain, which gravel road became almost impossible after the first real snow, and which farm kept its Christmas lights hanging until March. There was a yellow lab that chased the van every afternoon, and an older man named Mr. Keller who waited by his mailbox no matter how cold it was. That kind of routine made the job feel predictable. My daughter was 12 at the time, and she usually got home from school before I finished my route. A few afternoons each week, she would call while I was making the last stretch toward town. She would tell me about school, complain about homework, or ask what we were having for dinner. Half the time, I barely remembered those conversations afterward. One section of Route 17 ran past open fields and shallow drainage ditches that froze hard in winter. Near the middle of that stretch sat an abandoned farmhouse. Nobody had lived there for years. The porch leaned slightly to one side, several windows were boarded up, and weeds grew high around the collapsed fence line. In summer, it looked neglected. In winter, with snow packed around the foundation, it looked almost swallowed by the fields. I passed it every day, never slowed down. I never wondered who had lived there or why they left. It was just another landmark on a route I thought I understood completely. That was probably why I dismissed the first strange thing I noticed there one winter afternoon. Something was living near the farmhouse. The first thing I noticed was garbage scattered near the abandoned farmhouse. A torn black bag had been dragged into the ditch, and food wrappers were spread across the snow. I assumed raccoons had gotten into it. A few days later, one of the farmers on my route mentioned that several chickens had disappeared overnight. He blamed coyotes. Another woman 2 houses down told me she had seen what she called an ugly dog near the road. None of that seemed connected. Then I saw something myself. It crossed a field maybe 200 yards ahead of me, moving fast from one tree line toward the farmhouse. From that distance, I couldn't judge its size very well. It looked canine, but its back end seemed lower than its shoulders, almost like it was injured. I remember thinking it was probably a coyote with mange. About a week later, the temperature warmed enough to soften the snow. I stopped at the mailbox nearest the farmhouse and noticed tracks beside the road. They were distorted from melting, but the toes had spread out in a way that made them look almost like fingers. I took a picture and sent it to a coworker with a joke about something living out there. She replied, "That looks creepy." I laughed, put my phone away, and forgot about it. Later, that photograph became one of the few things I wished I had looked at more carefully. Before the snow changed and erased everything around them, it started appearing closer to the van. It started getting harder to dismiss after that. A few evenings later, I stopped to deliver a package at a house just past the abandoned farmhouse. While I was walking back to the van, I heard something moving in the drainage ditch beside the road. Not running, just shifting through dead grass. I stood there for maybe 2 seconds, trying to see into the ditch, then decided I had no reason to investigate and got back inside. Another afternoon, I saw the dark animal again. This time it was behind the abandoned farmhouse, closer than before. It looked bigger than I remembered, although I knew distance could play tricks. I watched it move along the foundation, then disappeared beneath a collapsed section of the porch. That was enough for me to call animal control. Told them there might be an injured dog or coyote living under the house. They checked the property later that day and found nothing. For a while, that actually made me feel better. Then, during another stop near the farmhouse, I heard a scraping sound against the back of the mail van. It sounded like claws dragging across metal. My first thought was a branch. Then I remembered there weren't any branches close enough to touch the van. I drove away without getting out. After that, I started locking the doors every time I stepped away, even if I was only walking 10 feet to a mailbox. I also stopped taking my afternoon break near that stretch of road. I still wasn't convinced anything dangerous was out there. I just didn't like feeling watched, without really knowing why I was nervous. The following week, the temperature dropped hard and snow started coming down heavily by mid-afternoon. A couple of coworkers told me to head back before the roads got worse. I probably should have. But I only had part of the route left, and I had driven those roads in worse weather, so I kept going. A few minutes later, my daughter called. She had just gotten home from school and wanted to know if we had any hot chocolate left. I remember laughing because she asked me the same thing every time it snowed. We talked about dinner, her science homework, and whether school might be canceled the next morning. Then I came around the bend near the abandoned farmhouse, and I stopped talking. It came out of the ditch. The snow had started drifting across the road by then, enough that I had to slow down just to keep the van centered between the ditches. That was when something moved ahead of me. At first, I thought it was a deer coming up out of the drainage ditch. I eased off the gas and expected it to cross. Instead, it crawled onto the road. I remember how dark its fur looked against the snow. Not just dark, but wet-looking, which made no sense in that kind of cold. Its ribs were deep and visible beneath the body, and the front legs looked longer than the back ones. It kept its head low, almost level with its shoulders. My first thought was a starving dog, then maybe a wolf. I stopped the van. The animal didn't run. It turned toward me and started coming closer. My daughter was still talking through the phone speaker, asking why I had gone quiet. I couldn't answer her. The animal reached the driver's side and disappeared below the window. A second later, I heard scratching against the lower door. Then the van shifted slightly. Not enough to move, just enough that I felt the suspension give. I looked through the windshield and saw a part of it rise beside the passenger side. Its head came up higher than I expected. That was the moment I realized how large it actually was. It was tall enough that for a second I could see its shoulders above the bottom edge of the passenger window clearly. Still couldn't see the face clearly. I heard heavy breathing, then another scrape against the metal. There was no growling, no barking. That somehow made it worse. I leaned on the horn. The animal dropped immediately, crossed in front of the van, and disappeared into the blowing snow beyond the ditch. I drove away faster than I should have, barely able to see the road. My daughter kept asking what was wrong.
Ow.
I told her I was fine. Then she asked why I was crying. I hadn't realized that I was. Everyone had an explanation. I reported it as soon as I got back. Animal control said it could have been a feral dog, maybe a wolf or a coyote that looked bigger because of the snow. None of those explanations sounded impossible. They checked the area again and found tracks near the ditch. But snowfall had softened the edges enough that nobody could identify them confidently. My supervisor looked at the van the next morning. There were several scratches along the lower side panel and near the door. He asked if I had hit brush. I said no. That was as far as it went. A few months later, I requested a different route. I never told anyone that was the reason. I still have the photograph of the print I took near the farmhouse. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if I should have paid more attention. The strange part is, people did believe me. They just believed I had seen an animal. Maybe they were right. What bothered me was that nobody could tell me what kind. And the last person in these stories didn't see something in the woods or on a frozen road. It came behind his own house. Story 3, something lived in the drainage culvert behind our fence wasn't really... I was 17 when this happened, and there was nothing about our neighborhood that felt remote. We lived in a subdivision at the edge of a growing town, the kind of place where half the houses looked identical, and somebody was always mowing a lawn on Saturday morning. My dad grilled on weekends. My sister left muddy shoes by the patio door. And there was a basketball hoop beside our driveway that leaned slightly to the left. Behind our row of houses was a stretch of undeveloped scrubland, with a concrete stormwater channel running through it. The channel widened near our property and disappeared into a drainage culvert beneath the road. When I was younger, the neighborhood kids explored back there constantly. We caught tadpoles, built little ramps for our bikes, and walked through the dry sections of the channel when it hadn't rained. My sister was 10 and still liked going down there after storms to look for frogs. None of us thought of it as wilderness. It was just the space behind the fence. Our neighbor had a dog that barked at delivery trucks, squirrels, and practically anyone wearing a hat, so hearing it lose its mind outside never seemed important either. That whole area felt ordinary because I had grown up with it. I knew where the ground stayed muddy, where the weeds grew highest, and where the culvert came out. So when something started showing up around it, my first reaction wasn't fear. It was annoyance. The dog started barking at the drain. The first thing that changed was our neighbor's dog. He wasn't normally the kind of dog that barked for no reason. Delivery trucks? Sure. Strangers at the fence? Sometimes. But for about a week, he started standing near the back of their yard every evening, barking toward the drainage channel. Everyone assumed raccoons. A few nights later, we found one of our trash bags ripped open beside the bin. Another time, a plastic food container disappeared completely. My dad blamed animals getting in from the scrubland. After a heavy rain, I noticed muddy prints near the broken section of our back fence. They looked like animal tracks, but the ground was so wet that every step had smeared outward. I didn't pay much attention. Then my sister came inside one evening and said she had seen a big skinny dog go into the culvert. My mom told her not to get close to stray animals. My dad said it was probably a coyote. Nobody was scared. A few nights later, I took the trash outside after dark. As I reached the bin, I heard scraping from somewhere beyond the fence. Not loud, just a slow, rough sound against concrete or wood. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam reached the ditch, but I couldn't see anything. The scraping stopped immediately. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. That was the first time the area behind our house made me want to go back inside. It was watching the backyard a few nights after that. The patio motion lights started coming on after midnight. The first time, my dad looked outside and said it was probably a cat. The second time, nobody even bothered checking. By the fourth or fifth night, I had started noticing it too. My bedroom was upstairs, facing the backyard, and one night I heard the light click on through the blinds. I got up and looked down. Something was moving near the far fence. It was too dark to identify, just a shape passing between the weeds and the shadow of a tree. I watched it stop beneath the branches and stay there for almost a full minute. At one point, it lifted the front half of its body. That was what caught my attention. For a second, it looked much taller than I expected. I couldn't tell if it had put its front feet against the tree or simply straightened on uneven ground. Then it dropped back down and disappeared behind the fence. The next afternoon, I went out to look. One broken section of wood had fresh mud smeared across it. Caught on a splinter were several strands of coarse dark hair. I showed my dad. He studied it for a few seconds and said an injured coyote was probably getting into the neighborhood. That explanation made sense. He agreed my sister shouldn't go outside alone until animal control had checked the area. For the first couple of days, we were careful. Then normal life took over. I had school, my dad had work, my mom had errands. My sister had homework and friends knocking at the door. Nothing else happened, and without another incident, the whole thing started to feel less urgent. That was probably our biggest mistake, although it didn't feel like one then. A few evenings later, my parents drove out to pick up dinner. I stayed home with my sister and was sitting in the living room playing a game with headphones on. At some point, she went into the backyard to grab something she had left near the patio. I never heard her tell me. Only noticed the door had closed when the neighbor's dog started barking. Not its usual barking. This was frantic, continuous, and aimed directly at our yard. I took off my headphones and stood up. Then I saw my sister through the glass. My sister was standing between it and the door when I looked through the glass. My sister was standing near the middle of the yard, completely still. At the far fence, something was watching her. It was bigger than any coyote I had ever seen, and painfully thin, with patchy dark hair clinging to its sides. Its rib cage showed when it breathed. The front legs looked too long for the rest of the body, and its face was narrow enough that at first I thought maybe it was a starving dog. But the size was wrong. So was the way it held itself. It stepped through the broken section of fence without taking its eyes off her. My sister started backing toward the house. I opened the patio door and told her as calmly as I could to come inside. The animal moved faster. I ran out, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her toward me. She stumbled once, and for a second I thought she was going to fall. We made it through the doorway, just as the animal reached the patio. I slammed the glass door shut. It didn't jump at us. It didn't growl or bark. It just stopped. For several seconds, it stood there staring through the glass right outside our door. Then it lowered its head and sniffed along the bottom of the door. That was worse than if it had attacked. My sister was crying behind me, and I remember holding the lock even though the door was already secured. Then headlights swept across the backyard. My dad's truck had turned into the driveway. The animal jerked its head toward the light, spun around, and ran through the yard. It cleared the fence, crossed the drainage channel, and disappeared into the culvert before my dad even got out of the truck. We covered the culvert, but I still checked the yard. The police came that night, and animal control searched the drainage area the next morning. They found nothing. There were tracks in the mud near the fence and along the channel, but nothing clear enough to prove what had made them. The broken section of our fence was repaired that weekend, and weeks later, after neighbors complained about animals getting into the drainage system, the city installed a heavier grate over the culvert entrance. The official explanation stayed the same: a diseased coyote. Maybe a large stray dog. Honestly, I can accept that. My sister eventually stopped talking about what happened. For her, it became one of those frightening childhood memories that faded as she got older. It never faded for me. I moved away years ago. I live elsewhere now, nowhere near that drainage channel. But if I have to open a back door at night, I look through the glass first. I check the fence line. I check the shadows near the yard. I listen before I step outside. It sounds small, but that is what the encounter changed. Something I had done without thinking my entire life suddenly became something I could never do casually again anymore. The part they couldn't explain away what connects these three stories is not proof that something impossible was out there. In every case, there are explanations that make sense. Nighttime changes distance. Fear changes memory. A sick animal can look completely different from what you expect. Mange can strip away fur and distort the shape of a coyote. A starving dog can move strangely. A bear seen from the wrong angle can look far taller than it really is. Any one of those things could explain what happened. The people who told these stories know that. The first man can admit that rain, bad visibility, and uneven ground may have changed what he saw on the logging road. But his father had spent decades outdoors, and after that night, he quietly ended a family tradition he had never wanted to give up. The mail carrier nose, snow, and panic may have made the animal beside her van seem larger. But she had passed thousands of animals during years on that route, and only one encounter made her ask to leave it. And the third narrator still believes the thing behind his house was probably a diseased coyote or stray dog. He still checks the yard before opening the door. That is the part that stays with me. Not that any of them proved they saw a monster. None of them did. What stayed with them was the uncertainty. None of them ever found a better answer. Something was there. Something left tracks, moved through brush, scratched metal, crossed roads, watched from fences, and changed the way ordinary places felt afterward. Sometimes the most disturbing part of an encounter is not believing you saw something impossible. It is knowing that something completely real was standing in front of you, and still having no idea what it was.